I never believed in monsters until I became the proof they could speak. My name was Interrogator Hadrius Velt, and for 17 years I served the Ordo Xenos with the cold efficiency expected of those who police the boundaries between humanity and the nightmare beyond. I had overseen the purging of 3 gene cult infestations, recommended exterminatus on 2 occasions, and personally executed 47 individuals whose very existence threatened Imperial stability. I was good at my work because I understood a simple truth. The alien does not negotiate, does not reason, does not seek common ground. The alien is cancer, and cancer must be cut away. Then they brought me the prisoner, and everything I knew dissolved like morning mist beneath a sun I should never have witnessed. The facility was designated Research Station Epsilon 70, though we called it the Black Archive when we thought the servitors weren't recording. Deep in the Ghoul stars, built into an asteroid that had been hollowed out and filled with cogitator banks, holding cells, and interrogation chambers. The station existed in no official record, drew its resources from diverted tithes, and housed specimens that would cause riots if the common citizen knew they breathed the same universe. I had been stationed there for 2 months, coordinating xenobiological analysis with the Mechanicus adepts who treated living things as flawed machines in need of documentation. The Vox call came during the sleep cycle, dragging me from dreams of my daughter's face, a memory I kept locked away because hope is poison in the work we do. Inquisitor Crave's voice crackled through the speaker with that peculiar mix of excitement and dread I had learned to fear. "Interrogation Chamber 5, he said. Immediately. Something extraordinary has happened. I dressed in the dark, muscle memory guiding my fingers through the clasps of my storm coat, and made my way through corridors that hummed with the breath of ancient air recyclers. The station was always cold, kept at temperatures that discouraged bacterial growth and made it easier to preserve xenobiological samples. My breath formed thin clouds that dissipated into the recycled air, and I could hear my footsteps echoing off walls painted in that particular shade of institutional grey that seems designed to remind you that individuality is a luxury. Interrogation Chamber 5 was in the deep section, where we kept the specimens that exhibited unusual behavioral patterns. I had been there 3 times before, once to observe a crude mercenary who had learned Gothic through some biological absorption process I didn't understand, once to witness the dissection of a Tau diplomat who had somehow survived 3 months of enhanced questioning, and once to watch a tech priest attempt to communicate with what we believed was an orc mech boy, though the creature had died shrieking before any useful intelligence could be extracted. The chamber door was flanked by 2 Kassakin elite stormtroopers with carapace armor and hellguns held ready. They knew me, nodded once, and one keyed in the entrance code, while the other kept his weapon trained on the doorway, in case something tried to escape. Professional paranoia, the kind that keeps you alive when you work this close to things that should not exist. Inside, the chamber was arranged like a theater, with observation tiers rising up from a central floor where the examination table sat beneath harsh lumens. Inquisitor Crave stood at the railing of the first tier, his augmetic eye whirring as it focused on something below. 3 tech priests clustered near a bank of cogitators, their mechadendrites twitching with what might have been agitation or excitement. I had never learned to read their machine-modified body language. And there, on the table, was the creature. I had seen hundreds of xenoforms in my career. I had watched dissections of orc physiology that revealed biological systems operating on principles that violated every law of chemistry. I had studied the nightmarish elegance of Tyranid bioforms, organisms sculpted for singular purpose with an efficiency that would make the most devoted tech priest weep with envy. I had even, once, been in the same room as a captured Eldar corsair and felt the weight of its contempt radiating like heat from a furnace, but I had never seen anything like this. It was roughly humanoid in the way that a statue is roughly humanoid. The basic architecture was there, but every detail was wrong. The creature stood perhaps 8 feet tall, with skin that looked like aged leather stretched over a frame that suggested both great strength and ponderous weight. Its head was massive, dominated by a broad, flat skull that swept back in a crest of what looked like bony plates. The face, if you could call it that, had small, dark eyes set deep beneath heavy brow ridges, and a mouth that seemed too wide, filled with flat teeth designed for grinding rather than tearing. But what drew my attention, what made my breath catch in my throat, were the restraints. The creature was bound to the examination table with adamantium chains thick enough to hold a space marine, and yet it sat there with an air of patient waiting, its massive hands folded across its abdomen, in a posture I recognized from 1,000 interrogations, the pose of someone who expected to be heard. "What is it?" I asked, descending the stairs to join Crave at the railing. "We're calling it a Zoat," Crave said, and his voice carried a tremor I had never heard before. The Inquisitor was a man who had stared into the warp and come back sane, who had fought demon princes and lived to write the reports. Fear was something he inflicted, not something he felt. The Adeptus Mechanicus has fragmentary records dating back to the Great Crusade. The Ultramarines encountered specimens on several worlds in the Eastern Fringe. Reports were inconsistent. "Dangerous?" I asked, though the question felt inadequate. "Unknown," one of the tech priests said, his vox speaker turning his words into a metallic drone. "Initial xenobiological analysis suggests herbivorous dietary habits. Musculature indicates capabilities consistent with heavy labor organisms. But the cranial capacity..." He paused, mechadendrites twitching. "The cranial capacity suggests intelligence comparable to baseline human." I stared at the creature, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew of Xeno's behavior. Intelligent aliens existed, the Eldar, the Tau, even the damned orcs in their savage way. But intelligence in service to what? Every alien race we encountered wanted the same things: territory, resources, the elimination of humanity as a competing species. Intelligence made them more dangerous, not less. "How did we capture it?" I asked. Crave gestured to another tech priest, who activated a hololith display. Grainy images flickered into being above the cogitator banks, a jungle world I didn't recognize, heavy with vegetation that suggested an oxygen-rich atmosphere. The perspective was from a dropship's external picked recorder, descending through cloud cover toward a clearing where I leaned forward, squinting at the image. In the clearing, surrounded by ruins that might have been Imperial architecture or might have been something older, stood 3 of the creatures. They were gathered around what looked like a communication array, cobbled together from scavenged components. As the dropship descended, one of the creatures looked up, not with alarm but with what seemed like recognition. "They were broadcasting," Crave said quietly, "on Imperial frequencies, in low Gothic. The cold that ran through me had nothing to do with the station's temperature. What were they saying? That's why you're here, interrogator. That's why I pulled you from your sleep cycle and brought you to witness this." Crave turned away from the railing, and I saw that his hands were shaking slightly. "The creature has been asking for you, by name." The universe contracted to a point of perfect, crystalline horror. In my 17 years with the Ordo Xenos, I had developed protocols for almost every contingency. I knew how to extract information from captured Xenos through enhanced interrogation. I knew how to identify gene cult infection vectors. I knew how to coordinate planetary defense against Tyranid splinter fleets. But I had no protocol for this. A creature I had never seen, from a species I barely knew existed, asking for me by the name my daughter used to call me when she was small enough to think her father was a hero. "How?" I managed to ask, though my throat felt like it was closing. "We don't know," Crave said. "We found them broadcasting coordinates, offering information about Tyranid Hive fleet movements in exchange for diplomatic contact. When we interrogated the creature," he gestured at the Zoat on the table, "it spoke your name. Said you would understand. Said you were the one who needed to hear what it had to say." I looked at the creature again, searching its alien face for some hint of malice, some suggestion of the trap I knew must be waiting. But all I saw was that patient waiting. Those small dark eyes watching me with what might have been hope or might have been calculation, or might have been something I had no words for. "I'll speak with it," I said. Because what else could I say? Because somewhere in the back of my mind, in the place where I kept my daughter's memory, a voice was whispering that maybe this time would be different. That maybe this time the alien wouldn't be just another horror to be catalogued and destroyed. I knew, even as I descended the stairs to the examination floor, that this was how corruption began. This was how good servants of the Emperor fell. By listening to the one voice they should never hear, the voice that said perhaps there was another way. The creature watched me approach, and I could smell it now, not the rot I associated with Tyranid organisms, but something like wet earth and growing things, the smell of a greenhouse or a garden. Its breathing was slow and deliberate, each inhalation lifting its massive chest with hydraulic smoothness. "Interrogator Velt," it said, and its voice was like rocks grinding together, each word formed with visible effort around a mouth not designed for human speech. "Thank you for coming." "Thank you." I stopped 3 meters away, keeping my hand near the plasma pistol holstered at my side. "How do you know my name?" "How do you know my name?" "We have been watching," the creature said. "Studying. Learning your languages, your customs, your fears. We had to understand you before we could approach you with the truth you need to hear." "And what truth is that?" I asked, my voice flat, professional. This was an interrogation, I reminded myself. This was my domain, where I controlled the flow of information, where I decided what was real and what was deception. The creature's eyes, those small, dark eyes that seemed too knowing, fixed on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "That we are not your enemy," it said. "That we were made to be ambassadors, not warriors. That the Tyranids created us to speak with you, because they want to offer you something you will never accept, but must be offered nonetheless." Above us, I heard Crave's sharp intake of breath, heard the tech priest's mechadendrites suddenly go still, heard the universe itself seem to pause and hold its breath at the obscenity of what had just been spoken. "The Tyranids don't negotiate," I said, and my voice sounded distant in my own ears, as if someone else was speaking through my mouth. "They consume. They assimilate. They are the ultimate predator." "Yes," the Zoat said, and there was something like sadness in that grinding voice. "And that is why they sent us to explain what they cannot say themselves. Because what approaches in the darkness is worse than hunger, Interrogator Velt. What comes is something that will make you wish the Tyranids had consumed everything while there was still something left to consume." I should have walked away then. I should have recommended immediate termination of the specimen and purging of all related data. I should have done what I was trained to do, recognize the corruption for what it was and cut it out before it could spread. But I didn't. Because somewhere in the cold arithmetic of my mind, in the place where I calculated threat assessments and survival probabilities, a question had formed that I couldn't dismiss. "What if it's telling the truth?" "Explain," I said, and sealed my fate with that single word. The Zoat shifted slightly, the chains creaking with the movement, and began to speak in that grinding, patient voice. It told me things that violated everything I knew about the Tyranids, about the Great Devourer that had haunted the eastern fringe for centuries. It told me that the Hive Mind was not a mindless hunger but a desperate one, that the Tyranids fled from something at the galactic rim, something that made their consumption look like mercy. It told me that in their own incomprehensible way, the Tyranids had recognized that humanity might be the only force in the galaxy capable of standing against what pursued them. And it told me that the Zoat's organisms designed millions of years ago, when the Tyranids first learned that sometimes you needed to speak rather than simply consume, had been awakened from biological storage and deployed ahead of the main fleet with a message: "We can work together, or we can all die together. Choose." I listened, and with each word, I felt my certainty crumbling. Not because I believed its 17 years of training had armored me against obvious manipulation, but because the creature spoke with the weary authority of someone who knew they were delivering a message that would be rejected, that had to be delivered anyway, because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. When it finished, Silence filled the chamber, like water filling a ship's hull. I stood there, my hand still near my weapon, my mind racing through scenarios and contingencies, trying to find the angle, the deception, the trap. "You understand that I cannot recommend any action based on what you've told me," I said finally. "You understand that to even consider negotiating with the Tyranids is heresy of the highest order." "Yes," the Zoat said. "We understand. We have always understood. But we had to try, because the alternative is extinction for all of us. The Tyranids will arrive, and they will consume, and then what follows them will arrive, and it will make that consumption look like a blessing." "What follows them?" I asked, and hated myself for asking, for letting curiosity override protocol. The Zoat's eyes closed, and when they opened again, I saw something in them I recognized from 100 interrogations, something I had seen in the faces of those who had witnessed horrors beyond articulation. The look of someone who had seen too much and survived only because they had no choice. "We have no name for it in your language," the creature said. "The Tyranids have no name for it in their genetic memory. It is simply the thing that ended the previous galaxy, and it is coming here to finish what it started." I wanted to call it lies, wanted to dismiss it as Zeno's manipulation designed to sow discord and confusion. But the Zoat wasn't trying to convince me, wasn't pleading or threatening or negotiating. It was simply stating facts with the tired resignation of someone who had already accepted that the facts didn't matter, that nothing they said would change what was coming. "We will study your claims," I said, falling back on protocol because it was all I had left. "We will analyze your physiological structure, your genetic code, your behavioral patterns. If there is any truth to what you've told me, we will find it." "Will you?" the Zoat asked, and there was something like pity in that grinding voice. "Or will you simply catalog us as another xenoform to be purged, another threat to be eliminated, because accepting that we might be telling the truth would require you to question everything you've built your life around?" The words hit harder than any physical blow because they were true. Because I had already made my decision the moment I walked into this chamber. Because I was a loyal servant of the Imperium, and loyal servants didn't entertain the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the universe was more complicated than the simple narratives we told ourselves to justify the atrocities we committed in humanity's name. I turned and walked away, my footsteps echoing off the chamber walls, and left the creature sitting there in its chains, patient and doomed, and aware that it had delivered its message to ears that would never truly hear it. But I was wrong about one thing. I thought I was walking away from the creature and back to the certainty of my duties. What I didn't realize was that I was walking deeper into a labyrinth of questions that would consume the next 3 months of my life and ultimately destroy everything I thought I knew about my place in the universe. The interrogations continued daily. Inquisitor Craver attended the first week, then began sending subordinates, then stopped coming entirely. The tech priests rotated through in shifts, their mechadendrites recording every word, every gesture, every biometric fluctuation, and I was there for all of it, asking questions that grew progressively more specific, more technical, more desperate. The Zoat answered everything. It described Tyranid fleet movements with a precision that matched our best intelligence reports. It explained the biological mechanisms by which the Hive Mind coordinated across light years, using terminology that sent the tech priests into frenzies of hypothetical modeling. It provided genetic sequences that suggested the Tyranids had encountered and absorbed thousands of intelligent species across multiple galaxies, each one contributing new capabilities to the collective. And it told us about the others, the thing pursuing the Tyranids across the void. It described them as entropy given purpose, as the heat death of the universe accelerated and weaponized, as something that made the Tyranids' biological hunger look like the innocent appetite of a newborn child. I wanted to dismiss it as sophisticated deception, but the more I interrogated the creature, the more I encountered a fundamental problem. It never tried to persuade me. It simply answered questions, provided information, and waited with that terrible patience for us to make our own conclusions. 3 weeks into the interrogations, I made a mistake. I asked the Zoat why the Tyranids had chosen me specifically to receive their message. The creature's response changed everything. "Because you have a daughter," it said, and my blood turned to ice in my veins. "Because 17 years ago, before you joined the Ordo Xenos, you were a magistrate on a frontier world. Because you made a decision that saved 3,000 people and damned yourself to a lifetime of wondering if you had done the right thing. Because the Hive Mind studied humanity's decision-making patterns and determined that you, interrogator Hadrius Velt, possessed the psychological profile most likely to understand what we are trying to tell you. I should have asked how it knew these things. I should have demanded explanations for how the Tyranids had accessed classified personnel files, how they had learned details of my past that existed only in sealed inquisitorial records. But I didn't, because I was too busy remembering. The frontier world had been called Thessia Prime, and I had been its chief magistrate during the food riots that followed 3 failed harvests. I had stood in the central square with 3,000 desperate citizens demanding grain that didn't exist, and I had made a choice. I had ordered the planetary governor's personal reserves seized and distributed, knowing it would end my political career but would prevent mass starvation. The riots had stopped. The people had survived. And I had been quietly reassigned to the Ordo Xenos, where my willingness to break rules for the greater good could be put to more appropriate use. "How long have you been watching us?" I asked, and my voice sounded hollow. "Since we first detected your species," the Zoat said. "Since the Tyranids tasted your genetic code and recognized something they had never encountered before. A species that chose self-sacrifice over self-preservation, that valued abstract concepts like duty and honor over immediate survival. The Hive Mind found you fascinating, disturbing, potentially useful. Useful for what? For fighting what comes after. For standing against entropy itself. For being the one species in this galaxy that might actually refuse to simply lie down and die when confronted with inevitable extinction. I stood there in that cold chamber, beneath those harsh lumens, and felt the architecture of my beliefs beginning to crack. Not because I trusted the Zoat, I didn't, but because it was telling me things that fit too perfectly with classified intelligence I had access to. Reports of anomalous stellar phenomena in the galactic east, worlds going dark, not from Tyranid consumption but from something else, something that left only void behind. "I need to report this to Inquisitor Crave," I said, turning toward the exit. "He already knows," the Zoat said. "Why do you think he stopped attending the interrogations?" I froze, my hand halfway to the door panel. "The Inquisitor received confirmation 3 days ago," the creature continued. "Long-range auger scans detected an anomaly approaching from the galactic rim, something vast, something that makes Tyranid hive fleets look like scattered organisms in comparison. He has been coordinating with the Ordo Xenos High Command, trying to determine if the threat is real or if it's an elaborate Tyranid deception." "And?" I asked, though I already knew the answer from the way my stomach was twisting itself into knots. "And they have concluded that it doesn't matter, even if the threat is real, even if something worse than the Tyranids is coming. The Imperium cannot afford to negotiate with Xenos. It would undermine every principle the Imperium is built upon. It would suggest that humanity is not supreme, that we need alien assistance to survive. Better to die faithful than live corrupted." The logic was flawless. The logic was exactly what I would have argued myself 3 weeks ago. The logic was the reason I had spent 17 years hunting Xenos without remorse or hesitation. "Then why tell me any of this?" I demanded, rounding on the creature. "If Crave already knows, if the decision has already been made, why waste breath on someone who can't change anything?" The Zoat's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw something in them beyond patient waiting. I saw calculation, cold and precise, as any tech priest's programming. "Because you are going to be given a choice," it said. "And I wanted you to make that choice with full knowledge of what it means." Before I could respond, the chamber's Vox system crackled to life. Crave's voice filled the space, calm and professionally detached. "Interrogator Velt, please return to the command level immediately. We have matters to discuss." I looked at the Zoat one last time, searching its alien face for some hint of what was coming, but all I saw was that same patient acceptance, as if the creature had already watched this conversation play out 1,000 times and knew exactly how it would end. The walk to the command level felt longer than usual, every corridor stretching into infinity, every doorway a threshold I couldn't uncross. Station servitors shuffled past with their blank, lobotomized expressions, and I envied them their inability to understand what was happening. Ignorance was a blessing in the Imperium. Knowledge was the first step toward corruption. Crave waited for me in his private office, a sparse chamber dominated by a desk made of dark wood imported from Holy Terror at ruinous expense. Behind him, a viewport showed the slow rotation of distant stars, their light cold and ancient. The Inquisitor had aged noticeably in the 3 weeks since the Zoat's arrival, new lines carved deep around his eyes, new grey threading his hair. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing, some instinct warning me that sitting would make what came next easier to deliver. "You've done excellent work with the Xenos specimen," Crave began, his voice carrying none of the tremor I had heard when we first discovered the Zoat. He had regained his composure, retreated into the armor of duty and protocol. "Your interrogation reports have provided valuable intelligence on Tyranid organizational structure and communication methods. But we're going to terminate the specimen," I said, because I could already see how this would unfold. "Yes." Crave met my eyes without flinching. "The creature represents an unacceptable contamination risk. Its claims about some greater threat pursuing the Tyranids are either sophisticated deception or the paranoid projections of a species fleeing its own inevitable consumption. Either way, we cannot allow such narratives to spread. The morale impact alone would be catastrophic." "What if it's telling the truth?" I asked, and heard my own voice as if from a great distance. Crave's expression didn't change. "Then we die as we have always intended to die, fighting in the Emperor's name, untainted by alliance with Xenos abominations. The Imperium has stood for 10,000 years on the principle that humanity must remain pure, must remain separate, must never compromise with the alien. To abandon that principle now would destroy everything our species has achieved. Everything we've achieved," I said slowly, "is built on an empire of corpses and a theology of extinction. What if the Zoat is right? What if humanity's refusal to adapt, to consider alternatives, to acknowledge that maybe we're not the center of the universe? What if that's the real threat?" The words hung in the air between us like an accusation. I watched Crave's face, waiting for anger or disappointment or the cold fury of someone who has just heard heresy spoken aloud. But what I saw instead was something worse: understanding. "I know," he said quietly. "Emperor, help me. I know. I've spent 3 weeks reading the classified reports, reviewing the auger data, consulting with astropaths who describe something in the deep void that makes them weep blood just thinking about it. I know that the Zoat is probably telling the truth. I know that something is coming, something that will make the Tyranids look like a blessing in comparison. Then why? Because knowing and acting are different things, interrogator. Because even if negotiating with the Tyranids might give us a chance at survival, the cost of that negotiation would be everything the Imperium stands for. We would have to acknowledge Xenos as equals. We would have to compromise our doctrine. We would have to admit that humanity alone is not sufficient to face what the galaxy contains, and that admission would shatter the faith that holds our entire civilization together." He stood, walking to the viewport, hands clasped behind his back in a gesture I recognized from 100 briefings. "Do you know what happens when that faith breaks? I've seen it. I've walked through the ruins of worlds where people lost their belief in the Emperor's protection, where they decided that cooperation with Xenos might be preferable to endless war. Do you know what those worlds look like? Empty, silent, consumed not by Tyranids or chaos, but by their own despair, by the simple realization that maybe the universe doesn't care about human exceptionalism, that maybe we're not the chosen species, that maybe we're just another race scrambling to survive. So we're going to kill the Zoat, I said, and pretend this conversation never happened. We're going to ignore a potential alliance because the political cost is too high. We're going to let humanity die rather than compromise our principles. Yes, Crave said, turning to face me. That is exactly what we're going to do. Because the alternative is chaos. Because if word gets out that the Ordo Xenos is considering negotiations with Tyranids, every radical faction in the Imperium will see it as validation. Every world that's ever chafed under Imperial authority will wonder if they too should seek their own accommodations with Xenos. The entire edifice will crack, and what pours through those cracks will be worse than any external threat. I wanted to argue. I wanted to rage against the cynical logic that would sacrifice survival for ideology. But I couldn't, because I understood. I had spent 17 years enforcing the very principles Crave was describing. I had killed people for less than what we were discussing now. I had pulled the trigger on men and women whose only crime was suggesting that maybe there were alternatives to the Imperium's genocidal xenophobia. When? I asked. Tomorrow morning. The specimen will be terminated. The research data will be classified at the highest level. And this station will be sterilized of any record that the Zoat was ever here. You will return to your regular duties, and we will never speak of this again. And if I refuse? Crave's expression turned regretful. Then you will be placed in protective custody until such time as you can be properly debriefed and reassigned. I don't want to do that, Velt. You're a good interrogator, a loyal servant of the Emperor. But I will do what I must to protect the Imperium from information it cannot safely process. I should have accepted it. I should have nodded and walked out, and let the machine of Imperial justice grind forward as it always had. But instead I found myself thinking about my daughter, about the choice I had made on Thessia Prime, about the 3,000 people who had lived because I was willing to break rules for the greater good. I want to speak with the Zoat one more time, I said, before the termination. There are questions I still need answered for the official report. Crave studied me with the penetrating gaze of someone who had spent decades reading lies and half-truths in the faces of the guilty. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded slowly. 1 hour. Supervised. And Velt, he paused. Something like sympathy flickering across his features. Don't make me regret trusting you. The descent to Interrogation Chamber 5 felt like walking into my own tomb. 2 Kaskin flanked me, their presence a reminder that trust had limits, that even loyal interrogators could fall to corruption if exposed to the wrong information for too long. The tech priests had been cleared out, the cogitator banks powered down, leaving only the harsh lumens and the creature waiting in its chains. The Zoat looked up as I entered, and I could swear I saw recognition in those dark eyes, the kind of recognition that came from having watched this scene play out exactly as expected. 1 hour, I said without preamble. Then you're going to be terminated. No trial, no appeals, no last-minute revelations that change anything. I need you to understand that. I understand, the Zoat said in that grinding voice. We have always understood. This was the most likely outcome from the moment we were deployed. Then why? I demanded, moving closer despite the Kasirkan's warning gestures. Why go through the charade? Why deliver a message you knew would be rejected? Why not just let the Tyranids consume us if that's our inevitable fate anyway? The creature shifted in its chains, the metal creaking with the movement, and when it spoke, its voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before, not sadness or resignation but something like respect. Because you deserve the chance to choose, it said. Because the Hive Mind has consumed 10,000 species across 7 galaxies, and not one of them ever had the opportunity to understand what was happening before it was too late. You are the first, perhaps the last. And even if you choose extinction over compromise, even if you walk willingly into oblivion wrapped in your certainty of human supremacy, at least you will have made that choice with open eyes. That's not mercy, I said. That's cruelty. Yes, the Zoat agreed. But it is also recognition. The Hive Mind looked at humanity and saw something worthy of cruelty. Something that deserved more than simple consumption. Something that might actually have been worth preserving, if you could have overcome your fear of admitting you need help. I stood there, my chronometer ticking away the minutes I had left, and felt the full weight of what the creature was offering. Not salvation but acknowledgement, not rescue but respect. The Tyranids, the mindless, devouring swarm we had fought for centuries, were telling us that we mattered enough to be given a choice, and we were choosing death because the alternative required admitting we weren't alone. "Tell me about the others," I said finally. "Tell me what's really coming." The Zoat's eyes closed, and for a long moment I thought it wouldn't answer. Then it began to speak, and its words painted a picture of something I lacked the conceptual framework to fully comprehend. It described entities that existed outside the normal flow of causality, that experienced time as space and space as time, that consumed not matter or energy but possibility itself. It told me about galaxies where every sun had been extinguished, where every world had been reduced to perfect crystalline silence, where even the basic laws of physics had been systematically erased and replaced with something else, something that served purposes too alien to name. "The Tyranids flee because they cannot fight entropy," the Zoat said. "They can consume matter, absorb energy, evolve beyond almost any threat. But they cannot fight something that simply erases the rules by which existence operates, and neither can you. Not alone." "Together, then," I said, and heard how hollow it sounded. "You're saying humanity and the Tyranids together might stand a chance?" "No," the Zoat said, and its voice carried a finality that made my chest tighten. "Together, you might survive long enough to understand what is destroying you. Together, you might gather enough knowledge to recognize the pattern before it completes. Together, you might die with comprehension instead of dying in ignorance. That is the only hope the Hive Mind can offer." "That's not hope," I said. "That's just delayed extinction." "Yes, but delay matters when what you're delaying is the end of everything. Every year you survive is another year to evolve, to adapt, to perhaps find something the others haven't encountered before. The Tyranids have been fleeing for millennia, learning with each galaxy they consume, growing stronger with each species they absorb, and still it's not enough. But you," the creature's eyes opened, fixing on mine with terrible intensity, "you have something the Tyranids don't. You have the capacity for irrational hope, for believing in victory, even when every logical calculation says you should surrender. The Hive Mind finds that fascinating, disturbing, potentially useful." My chronometer showed 30 minutes remaining. Behind me, I could hear the Cascans shifting their weight, fingers never far from their triggers. In a few hours, this creature would be dead, its genetic material dissolved in promethium, all record of its existence purged from every databank in the station, and I would return to my duties, interrogating Xenos and recommending their termination, enforcing the Imperium's policy of eternal warfare against everything that wasn't human. Unless, the thought came fully formed, complete with all its terrible implications. I could hear my own voice in my head, laying out the logic with the same cold precision I brought to threat assessments. If the Zoat was telling the truth about the others, then Crave's decision to terminate it was arguably treason against humanity's survival. If there was even a small chance that alliance with the Tyranids could provide information crucial to facing this new threat, then preserving that chance became more important than maintaining ideological purity. And if I truly believed that survival mattered more than principle, then I had a moral obligation to act on that belief. But that way lay corruption. That was how every radical justified their heresies, every traitor their betrayals. This is for the greater good. This is necessary for survival. This is worth compromising everything I believe in. What are you thinking, interrogator? The Zoat asked, and there was something like concern in its voice. I'm thinking, I said slowly, that you've told me exactly what you needed to tell me to manipulate me into doing something catastrophically stupid. I'm thinking that this entire conversation has been designed to exploit my documented willingness to break rules for what I perceive as the greater good. I'm thinking that the Tyranids are more sophisticated than we ever imagined, and that you are proof of just how subtle their infiltration strategies can be. Yes, the Zoat said. All of that is true. We were designed to appeal to individuals like you, Interrogator Velt. We were created to speak to your weaknesses, to exploit your psychological profile, to make you question the certainties that keep the Imperium stable. Everything I have told you might be sophisticated manipulation aimed at fragmenting human unity. You have no way of verifying any of my claims, no way of knowing if the others truly exist, or if they're simply a narrative construct designed to make the Tyranids seem like a lesser threat by comparison. Then why tell me this? I demanded. Why admit to the manipulation? Because the truth or falsehood of our claims is less important than what you choose to do with them. Because the Hive Mind wants to understand how humans make decisions when confronted with existential uncertainty. Because you are an experiment, Interrogator, and the results of that experiment will be recorded whether you choose to believe us or not. 20 minutes. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the sweat gathering beneath my storm coat, despite the station's cold. Every protocol I had ever learned screamed at me to walk away, to let the termination proceed, to file my report, and move on to the next assignment. But underneath those screams, quieter but persistent, was the voice that had made me seize the governor's grain stores. The voice that said, sometimes the right thing looked exactly like the wrong thing, until you had the perspective to tell them apart. If I were to theoretically prevent your termination, I said, choosing words carefully, what would you do? Where would you go? Back to the Hive fleet, the Zoat said. Back to deliver the data we've gathered about human psychology, decision-making patterns, and susceptibility to persuasion. Back to inform the Hive Mind that humanity, as expected, chose ideological purity over pragmatic survival. And then we wait for the others to arrive, and we watch this galaxy fall silent, just like all the others. Unless, I said. Unless, the Zoat agreed, someone decides that maybe the Imperium's principles are less important than the survival of every living thing in this galaxy. Unless someone is willing to commit treason for the chance, not the certainty, just the chance that cooperation might matter. Unless you, Interrogator Hadrius Velt, believe that your daughter's future is worth more than your loyalty to an institution that would sacrifice her along with everyone else, rather than admit it needs help. And there it was. The manipulation laid bare, the psychological lever revealed in all its crude simplicity. They had studied me, learned my history, identified the one thing that might override my training, and I was letting them do it because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. How? I asked. And with that word I crossed a threshold I could never uncross. The Zoat told me. It was surprisingly simple, really. The station ran on automated systems, supervised by tech priests who thought in machine code and servitors who didn't think at all. A few falsified authorization codes, a corrupted data packet in the cogitator network, a carefully timed distraction during the shift change. It could work. It probably would work. And afterward, I would be a traitor, a heretic, a corrupted interrogator who had freed a Xenos specimen and doomed his own soul in the process. But my daughter might live. 10 minutes. The Karskins were getting restless, checking their chronometers, exchanging glances that suggested they knew something was happening, even if they couldn't quite identify what. I had to decide. Right now, in this moment, I had to choose between everything I believed and everything I loved. I'll do it, I said, and felt something fundamental break inside my chest. Emperor, forgive me. I'll do it. The Emperor, the Zoat said quietly, is a corpse on a throne, Interrogator. He cannot forgive you, but perhaps the species he tried to preserve will thank you for choosing their survival over his dead principles. I wanted to argue, wanted to defend the Imperium and its 10,000 years of bloody survival against every horror the galaxy contained. But I was too busy accessing the station's security protocols through my interrogator clearance codes too busy initiating the sequence that would release the Zoat's restraints, too busy activating the pre-programmed distraction that would draw the Kaskins to respond to a false emergency in another section. The chains fell away with a sound like chains falling away, obvious and damning and irreversible. The Zoat stood, towering over me, flexing muscles that could crush my skull with casual ease. I stood there, plasma pistol in hand, knowing I could still end this, still salvage some fragment of my loyalty by putting a superheated round through the creature's massive skull. "You won't," the Zoat said, reading my body language with the same terrible precision it had read my psychological profile. "Because you've already chosen. Because the choice was made the moment you asked, how? Because you are, in the end, exactly what we hoped you would be, human enough to care more about survival than principle. Go," I said, voice hoarse. Before I change my mind, the Zoat moved toward the emergency airlock, each step shaking the deck plating, and paused at the threshold. "What will you tell them?" it asked. "The truth," I said. "That you were more dangerous than we realized. That you escaped using capabilities we didn't know you possessed. That I failed to stop you because I underestimated the threat. They'll know you're lying, yes. But they'll also know that executing me for incompetence achieves nothing. They'll debrief me, reassign me, monitor me for signs of corruption, and I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I made the right choice, or if I just became another example of how easily humans can be manipulated by convincing Xenos." The Zoat's expression, if that immobile face could be said to have expressions, seemed to soften slightly. "For what it's worth, interrogator, the hive mind respects what you've done. Not many species produce individuals capable of betraying their deepest loyalties for abstract concepts like survival. Most simply die faithful to whatever god or ideology they've convinced themselves matters." "Get out," I said, raising the plasma pistol not to aim but to emphasize the command. "Get out before I remember that I'm supposed to be the Emperor's loyal servant." The Zoat left, moving through the airlock with surprising grace for something so massive, and I stood there in the empty chamber, listening to alarms beginning to wail throughout the station. The Kasakins would return soon, would find me standing over empty restraints with a story that would fool exactly no one. Crave would know what I'd done, would see through every lie and half-truth I tried to construct, and I would live with that knowledge for however many days or years remained before either the Tyranids consumed us, the others erased us, or the Imperium executed me for treason. But at least my daughter would have a chance. At least somewhere, someone would know that humanity had been offered a choice, and that one person, however flawed, had chosen survival over certainty. The interrogation that followed was exactly as brutal as I expected. Crave didn't rage or threaten, that would have been easier to endure. Instead, he simply looked at me with the disappointed expression of someone watching a promising protégé destroy themselves, and asked me again and again why I had done it, what I hoped to accomplish, whether I truly believed that betraying everything I claimed to value would somehow save humanity. I told him the truth. I told him about my daughter, about Thessia Prime, about the cold arithmetic that said sometimes you had to break rules to preserve what those rules were meant to protect. I told him that if there was even a small chance the Zoat was telling the truth, even a fraction of a possibility that alliance with the Tyranids might give us intelligence about the others, then that chance was worth more than my loyalty, or my life, or my soul. He listened without interruption, and when I finished, he sat in silence for a long time before speaking. "You're not wrong," he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him something. "About the arithmetic, about the possibility, about the value of information. But you're wrong about what that means for humanity. Because we don't survive through compromise, Velt. We survive through faith. We survive because every guard on every wall believes that humanity is worth dying for, that the Imperium's principles matter more than individual survival, that we fight not because we expect to win, but because fighting is what humans do. You take away that faith, and we collapse. We become just another failing species, desperately negotiating with anything that might postpone the inevitable. "And if the inevitable is coming whether we keep faith or not?" I asked. "Then we face it with our humanity intact," Crave said. "We face it knowing we never compromised, never surrendered, never admitted that we were insufficient. We face it as humans have always faced extinction, standing upright, weapons raised, defiant to the very end." I could have argued, I could have pointed out that defiance without survival was just suicide with better propaganda. But I was too tired, too hollowed out by what I'd done, to find the energy for debate. Instead, I simply asked what would happen to me now. "Penal Legion," Crave said. "Mind scrubbing would be the usual protocol, but your skills are too valuable to waste. You'll be assigned to a punishment battalion, sent to whatever war zone is currently consuming bodies at the highest rate. If you survive, and the actuarial tables suggest you won't, you might eventually earn redemption. More likely you'll die doing something uselessly heroic, and the Imperium will forget you ever existed." And the Zoat? The data? The threat? Classified at the highest level. Investigated by individuals with higher clearance than either of us. If the creature was telling the truth, if the others are real, then the Imperium will prepare as it always prepares, by fortifying, by fighting, by refusing to acknowledge that some threats can't be defeated through faith and firepower alone. And if the creature was lying, then no harm done beyond the loss of one corrupted interrogator. He stood, signaling that the interview was over. "For what it's worth, Velt, I understand why you did it. I've spent 30 years with the Ordo Xenos, and I've seen good men make bad choices for the right reasons. But understanding doesn't change what you are now. A traitor who chose Xenos over humanity. Personal sentiment over Imperial duty. You'll die in some forgotten trench on some meaningless battlefield. And the only mercy I can offer is that you'll probably die quickly." I was escorted from the station 3 days later, my few possessions packed into a single case, my interrogator credentials revoked, my identity stripped down to a prisoner number and a penal legion assignment. As the transport ship pulled away from Research Station Epsilon 70, I looked back at that cold asteroid with its secrets and its horrors, and wondered if I would ever know whether I'd made the right choice. The war zone they sent me to was called Meridian's Reach, a contested system in the Eastern Fringe, where Imperial Guard and Tyranid splinter fleets ground against each other in an endless meat grinder that served no strategic purpose beyond preventing the Xenos from gaining a foothold. The Penal Legion was exactly what I expected. Men and women who had failed the Imperium in some crucial way, given lasguns and minimal supplies, pointed at enemy positions, and told that redemption came through death in the Emperor's service. I had been there for 4 months when the sky changed. It started with the stars. They began to flicker, subtle at first, like candles in a draught. Then they started to fade, not dimming gradually, but simply ceasing to exist, as if someone was systematically erasing them from the universe. Within a week, half the visible stars had vanished. Within 2 weeks, the void itself looked wrong, too dark, too empty, too much like looking into an abyss that noticed you looking back. The Tyranids stopped attacking. It was subtle at first, easier to dismiss as tactical repositioning or the natural ebb and flow of biological warfare. But then the Vox channels started carrying reports from across the sector. Hive organisms withdrawing, bioships retreating, warrior forms abandoning positions they had held for months, not fleeing in panic but retreating with purpose, consolidating, gathering their strength, as if preparing for something worse than anything they'd faced before. The others had arrived. I wish I could tell you what they looked like, but I can't because they didn't look like anything. They were absence made manifest, void given purpose, the space where existence used to be. They moved through the system like a surgical instrument, precise and emotionless, and everything they touched simply stopped. Not destroyed, not consumed, stopped. Stars went dark, planets ceased to rotate, ships hung frozen in space, their crews neither living nor dead but locked in some state between existence and non-existence, that my mind refused to process. The Tyranids fought. I watched through auger feeds as bioships the size of cities threw themselves at the advancing emptiness, watched as warrior forms that could shred space marines apart simply froze mid-leap and hung there like insects in amber. The Hive Mind threw everything it had at the others. Billions of organisms coordinated in perfect unity. Genetic weapons that had ended 1,000 civilizations and achieved nothing. The others came, and the Tyranids stopped, and then the emptiness advanced toward our positions with the inevitability of entropy itself. I thought about the Zoat then, wondered if it had made it back to the Hive fleet, if it was watching this same scene play out across 100 worlds, if it felt anything like vindication at seeing its warnings prove true. I thought about Crave, about the Imperium's distant authority, about all the men and women who had chosen faith over pragmatism, principle over survival. I thought about my daughter, and wondered if she was still alive, if the emptiness had reached her world yet, if she would ever know that her father had tried, however inadequately, to save her. The penal legion broke when the others were 3 kilometers away. Men who had been fighting Tyranids without flinching, who had stood against warrior forms and carnifexes and even the occasional hive tyrant, simply dropped their weapons and ran. Not toward safety, there was no safety, but away from the wrongness, advancing across no man's land like winter frost, spreading across glass. I didn't run, not because I was brave, but because I was too tired. I stood there in my trench, watching the emptiness approach, and thought about choices and consequences, and the distance between wisdom and foolishness. The Zoat had been right. Not about everything. I still didn't know if cooperation between humanity and Tyranids would have made any difference, if the knowledge they offered could have prevented this, but it had been right about the fundamental equation. We had chosen death over compromise, chosen faith over pragmatism, chosen to face extinction with our principles intact rather than survival with our dignity questioned. And now we were dying. The emptiness reached my trench. I felt it before I saw it, a coldness that went beyond temperature, a silence that went beyond sound, a stillness that suggested the universe itself was holding its breath. I thought about Thessia Prime one last time, about the 3,000 people I had saved by breaking rules, about whether that choice had mattered in any meaningful sense when the others were erasing entire worlds from existence. Then I thought about the Zoat's final words to me. You are, in the end, exactly what we hoped you would be. Human enough to care more about survival than principle. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that small act of rebellion against certainty, that brief moment of choosing hope over faith, mattered in some way I couldn't comprehend. Or maybe it was meaningless, just another footnote in a galaxy drowning in futile gestures and noble stupidity. I'll never know, because the emptiness reached me, and I stopped thinking, and the universe continued erasing itself with the patient efficiency of something that had done this 10,000 times before, and would do it 10,000 times again. But somewhere, in whatever passed for consciousness within the Hive Mind, perhaps a record remained of the interrogator who broke his oaths for the slim chance at survival. Perhaps that record mattered. Perhaps it would be carried forward into whatever came after. A small testament to the fact that humanity, for all its flaws and failures and suicidal devotion to principle, had at least tried to be something more than another species waiting to die. Or perhaps not. Perhaps I was just another traitor who betrayed everything he claimed to value, who died for nothing in a forgotten war on a meaningless battlefield, whose choice mattered not at all in the vast machinery of galactic extinction. But I made the choice. That, at least, was mine.